Well, good morning to everyone that has just joined us, and hello to everyone that may be watching the replay. Welcome to the webinar. This time it is all about where next for invasive weed management, threats and challenges. I'm your host, Andy Ferguson, and joining me this morning, I'm pleased to welcome back Professor Max Wade, both PC trainer and technical director at ACOM. We are about to start the main presentation. Just before we make a start, for anyone that wishes to pose any questions over the course of the webinar, I'd first point you to the chat facility that in the desktop runs down the right or the left-hand side. If you want, you can email your questions to me at andy@property-care.org. That's andy@property-care.org. Or if you are so socially savvy, you can go to our social tools, either Facebook, LinkedIn, or X, formerly known as Twitter. Use the native messenger there and send us your message. So, Max, I can see we are now at 9 o'clock. I suppose many professionals joining or watching the replay will be well aware of the concerns surrounding invasive plants such as Japanese knotweed. Now, I suppose arguably within urban environments in the UK, it seems that we're almost kind of getting to grips with Japanese knotweed in these urban environments in terms of kind of successfully managing it. But what other invasive plants should we be concerned about? What are the challenges of combating these threats? And what do we need to do to prepare ourselves for these invasive invaders? I'm hoping you can give us some lovely and insightful information, Max, and I suppose over to yourself, good sir.
Thank you, Andy. And indeed, it's really quite a opposite time at the moment to be having a look at where next for invasive weed management, looking at some of the threats and challenges. And I hope as I'm talking to you this morning, you'll appreciate that now is actually a key time for us to be looking at the challenges, but also the opportunities that face us, all of us who are dealing with invasive non-native plant species across our British and Irish Isles. So I'll be briefly looking at the threats. Andy's already mentioned and hinted that we know what these are really, but no harm in just reminding ourselves. But also then what are the challenges? But maybe a bit of a fresh look in some ways. I hope to sort of get you thinking a little bit more. As Andy again indicated, we need to be shifting our sort of effort and resources from the urban environment, getting a better spread across the various elements of invasive weed impacts. And what's out there to support us in terms of our challenges? What might you be thinking you need? So do use the chat facility to comment and make your own suggestions, questions as we go. And then really ending up by having a think, are we actually prepared to tackle the challenges posed by these plants, these sort of successful plants that are impacting our environment? So just in case you needed to have any reassurance that whilst 42 might be the answer to the question of life, the universe and everything, in terms of the challenge imposed by invasive weeds, the answer is actually 30. And I think you can see that fairly clearly here. The GB invasive non-native species strategy runs to 2030. Biodiversity net gain is planned to be delivered over 30 years. There were 30 stands of Japanese knotweed on my trip into London on the train. There's now about 3. And you, and pretty much that's all of you, should be able to identify more than 30 plant species on Schedule 9 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act and the Invasive Alien Species Order. Points that I think I'll bring out as we go, just sort of indicate so some of the sort of the quantification, if you like, just to emphasize some new ideas, new thoughts in terms of dealing with invasive plants. So briefly, the impacts, yep, they're environmental, really an emphasis on destabilizing habitats and ecosystems. Probably need to underline that one. We've known about the economic costs. Probably the emphasis here is just to remind ourselves that it's across agriculture, forestry, transport, construction, recreation, utilities. Invasive plants are that successful that they can crop up pretty much anywhere. But not to forget the social aspects as well. These plants can cause harm. They can get in the way of stuff that we want to do in terms of recreation. So a spectrum of problems, and I'm sure you're all well aware of those. And my emphasis would be on destabilizing habitats and ecosystems as the one perhaps we should be putting quite a lot more effort into in order to sort of make things work, getting things joined up, which for me is the real challenge in terms of combating these threats. The lack of a joined up approach. We're throwing an awful lot of effort at dealing with this environmental impact. And to do that, we need to be able to recognize the species. I'll explain that that's a little bit more than just being able to identify them. We do have the potential for a fantastic surveillance database regionally and nationally, but at the moment, again, we're just not getting it joined up. We're not making the most of the information that's being collected on these plants. Once we've found them, and we're looking at them thinking, okay, is this actually a threat? Is it a hazard? What's the likelihood of that hazard occurring? We're looking at a risk assessment, and we could do with one that's more standardized in dealing with sites, local, regional scale impacts. And then lastly, how can we look to develop a more proactive and comprehensive approach across, and looking at those of you attending this morning, you really do represent across the cross section of a wide range of organizations and stakeholders dealing with invasive species. So looking at the joined up approach, the challenge is to achieve a more effective and joined up approach to deal with invasive non-native plants and other animals, and other invasive plants rather. So how can we do that? What is the secret, if you like, to success? And at the moment, I think we've got quite a bit of a way to go on here. Those of you who remember the RIMPs, I'll come on briefly to talk about those in a moment. They were a really good effort that was made in the past. From my perspective, these appear to have foundered somewhat. Do stick a note in the chat if you see otherwise, and there are RIMPs that are being used. But overall, I think we're lacking, have a marked absence really of leadership to work towards a joined up approach across the sort of various sectors. There's lots of effort being put into developing approaches to invasive non-native plants, but as professionals, the professional experts, you'd expect us to be taking more of a lead in this lead role, and this really hasn't happened. And it's something I think we need to sort of think about how we can develop. Where does the leadership need to come from? How can we develop that leadership so that, in terms of initiatives that have had a lot of effort put into them, this is one of the cover of one of the RIMPs, Regional Invasive Alien Species Management Plan. It's for the Southeast region. It was produced in 2018. As I say, I'm not aware, as a professional ecologist, it hasn't impacted on work that I do in the Southeast region, and it would be interesting to know where it is being used and how that might be sort of extended to make it sort of more comprehensive. If you look at what's in that particular RIMP, it's really impressive. It's looking at pathways, stakeholders, priority areas. It's looking at regional sites of high conservation value where impacts can be quite significant. It's looking at high-risk areas, hotspots, priorities. It really is an excellent overview and plan for the Southeast, but for some reason or other, it's not. This and other plans have not provided the sort of overall linkage and response and leadership in a way that we're needing. Nevertheless, something that we need to take into account as we move forward are the approaches that have already been taken. So there is a bit of an inability to recognise these species. That's not surprising. There are a lot of them. As I mentioned earlier, there's over 30 species that are really the usual suspects. When you go onto a site involved in a project, you're doing a survey, you should be able to recognise 30 or so of these plants and feed them into your invasive species management plan. And it doesn't stop there. We need to take into account the species that are now covered within the invasive alien species order. We need to be developing management plans or developing management plans for our clients. And then the other invasive species, those that are being identified through work undertaken by research teams, for example, at Coventry and Reading universities. These are plants we should be looking out for. This research is identifying these sorts of plants. Importantly, we should also not forget that in terms of particularly the sort of biodiversity imperative, that it's not just non-native plants that can be a problem. Native plants can be equally as problematic in sensitive habitats, and they need management, they need risk assessment, they need management in order to be able to deal with them properly. So quite a responsibility on us to be able to undertake this identification, and I've divided that into two parts really. So I think the first one is the ability to recognise those species that pose a threat. So that's not actually in terms of being able to identify them in a sort of taxonomic way, but just to be able to recognise them that they are posing a threat. Now, we're very good at doing this at a national level, but not so good in terms of a more local regional geography. But also we need to be looking ahead and thinking not just now, but also in the future. What are the plants that we need to be paying attention to avoid ourselves getting into a sort of giant hogweed Himalayan balsam type problem where the plants sort of got out of the bag a very long time ago, and we're having to spend an awful lot of effort, time and money in order to deal with them. And then secondly, yes, there's the need to actually be able to identify and put a name, confidently put a name to the species that we're dealing with. So important, I think, to sort of recognise the distinction and sort of to build a former, being able to recognise the ones that pose a threat into the work that we're doing, into the planning that we're hopefully going to engage in. So Tree of Heaven, it's sort of already arrived and is an increasing problem, or looks to be an increasing problem, certainly in cities like London, and its establishment can be remarkably rapid. It produces a dense canopy and can also pose significant problems to structures, underground services, etc. But is this also a problem in other cities? Who is dealing with it? Do we understand how to sort of cope with the plant? We need to have this overview both at a local authority level, for example. So I don't know what Cambridge City Council is doing regarding Tree of Heaven, but it's certainly spreading within that city too. Is it is it on their radar in terms of a problem that could become greater? Recent visit to Berlin, I was absolutely staggered to see the impact that this plant is having on the urban environment, and particularly the rail network. If we thought we had a problem with Japanese knotweed, tree of heaven on your rail network is orders of magnitude greater as a problem. So we need, and this is just one species that I'm commenting on. There are all the others. We need to have sort of similar ability to identify what their risks and threats are. And this is a complete contrast. Cyprus spurge, identified by Reading University as an ornamental that is potentially already maybe out of the bag and starting to establish itself outside of our gardens. Can we identify this? What are its problems? It's certainly a vigorously spreading perennial, so it's certainly got scope to become a problem. It belongs to the Euphorbia genus, and most of those produce irritant sap, but how much of a problem is that? And again, this is one of a whole range of plants that are being identified by really interesting, important research. Again, joined up approach. Are we picking that up? Are we looking for these plants when we're out doing our surveys? We need to join up in order to sort of get the best out of the work that we're all doing collectively. Just to remind you that the Property Care Association has got an invasive plant ID training course. Good opportunity. It's plant face to plant. Is that the right way to describe it? So you've got hands-on experience of a wide range of invasive plants, live specimens, and also their lookalikes, so that you can compare them with the sort of native or other plants, looking at sort of the various aspects that you would need to be able at the end of the course to tackle those 30 plus or so species as part of the work that you're doing. So one to have a think about. Our surveillance at regional and national levels, in terms of being able to report a sort of joined up approach, is unfortunately, I think, is still a bit on the inadequate side. We need to know the distribution of these species. We need to that fits into being able to know which ones are posing threats, which plants are heading in our direction, how fast are they spreading. These are all sort of key questions that we need to know the answers to. The disappointment is that we actually have probably the best recording system globally. The NBN Atlas, the National Biodiversity Network Atlas that you can see in the middle there, is fed into by all the local environmental record centres, local record centres. This creates a sort of a national database, but there are regional county databases, and it is fed into by a huge amount of work that is undertaken mainly by volunteer, unpaid recorders, in this case botanists, and feeding this information in. If you've looked through the screen here and noticed that actually professional ecologists, professional weed control specialists actually don't appear, and I have a nasty feeling that we don't actually contribute very much, if anything, into this database in terms of invasive non-native plant records. And probably because we're not contributing to it, we're also not making the most of it. So again, here's another example of where we could do better in getting a more joined up approach by contributing to this fantastic database and by using it to sort of feed into advising our clients, advising our projects in terms of how how best to use resources when it comes to decision making as to how we tackle these various species. So again, we can look to try to do a bit better. The risk assessment fitting into this sort of decision making process. So okay, we're able to identify it. We can see its distribution. We understand the threats that it poses, but how do we actually assess the risk? As on the screen, the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat does an excellent job in terms of looking at these plants from a national point of view, undertaking a sort of coordinating and publishing these risk assessments from the national scale. What we're lacking is the ability to risk assess at local, regional scales to help to target resources, help the decision-making process as to how best to, again, achieve a more coordinated, concerted approach. And that also applies to site-level assessment. Consultant ecologist, for example, undertaking a survey ahead of a road scheme, perhaps for national highways, confronted with a range of non-native invasive plants, has to make a decision in terms of what is the risk that this poses at different scales, risk to the project, risk in terms of it being spread beyond the project. And at the moment, these decisions are being made, but in not necessarily in an organised, well-structured, standardised approach, benefiting from sort of experience across the board. So a gap there that we need to think, how can we fill this? It's one that's been rattling around for a while, but we really do need to try to get to grips with how we undertake these risk assessments, hopefully do them in a more standardized approach so that we can understand and also help to that standardization and risk assessment does feed into coming back and checking that we made the right decisions and getting the feedback so that we can do a better job come the next road scheme or the next project that we're involved in. It's quite a lot to do. Quite considerable challenges, I think, is what we're discovering, and it's good to see that there is really quite a good range of existing and emerging guidance and support that's out there. Really, we've got to start off with the invasive non-native species strategy from a national, international perspective across GB. 30 years. Well, it started in 2023, but runs to 2030. So we've got quite a bit of time to input into it to help to achieve the goals that it sets out and the guidance that's provided within it in terms of how to go about dealing with what is described succinctly in terms of a sort of a national crisis from a biodiversity point of view, but also economic and social, as we've already seen. So we've got a good signpost, a good route laid out in the strategy. And if you haven't had a flick through it, look it up, work through it, and I think you'll see that somewhere in there you will be in there somewhere. Your role. It is all fairly clearly mapped out, and we all need to appreciate what we're doing in contributing to it, which will help us to work together in a more concerted approach. And this is also supported by the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat. It's now somewhat larger. It was, still is, a relatively small secretariat within government, as it were, but now it has an inspectorate and sort of increasingly valuable advice and support to us in the work that we're doing. So if you don't regularly check out their website, you should. There are some really good resources there that will help you doing your job, pretty much whatever it is that you're doing from an invasive species point of view. It provides a range of resources that could be really valuable to you. So if you haven't checked them out, they could make a difference. Just simply in terms of communicating to clients, if you're working with local authorities, etc., it helps to explain and use the resources from government in terms of helping local authorities to do their work. It gives more credibility to you, to us, in terms of the work that we're doing. I've already explained the potential enormous value of the National Biodiversity Network and the local environmental record centres. So just to sort of underline that we really need to be supporting that as well as using it. Then within the Property Care Association, we've got the Invasive Weed Control Group. What are they up to? Well, overall, they provide professional invasive weed management experts, hundreds of them across the and really across the GB, that on a day-to-day basis are out there dealing with invasive non-native weed. So that's great and good to know, but it needs to be more joined up in terms of feeding into other activities that are sort of going on in terms of dealing with these plants. As part of that, there is a code of practice for invasive non-native plants under production, as it were, and it's sort of moving on at a pace at the moment, and that will be valuable, really valuable, in again providing more of a sort of a unified approach, setting standards in terms of what one would expect in dealing with invasive non-native plants. As a professional, you can subscribe to the code, and that is obviously a good thing. To support that, been available for a while now, is a practical management manual for invasive non-native weeds, and that at the moment is planned to be revised. It's done a good job, but we've learned a lot in the intervening period. I think it was published in 2018, and we need to benefit from the additional information and also new species that will need to be included in it. There's a training program. Andy's already alluded to that. I'm sure we'll mention it again at the end of the webinar. And let's not forget that an emphasis, or the emphasis initially with the invasive weed control group, was on Japanese knotweed, and as part of that, it's produced a tried and tested accreditation process. It took a sort of a sector of the industry that was really quite problematic in terms of being able to be able to trust invasive weed experts dealing with Japanese knotweed. It was sort of very unregulated, and that had implications for insurance, house prices, mortgage lending, and so on. That this training and accreditation that's been produced has made a dramatic change, and also improved significantly the way in which we deal with Japanese knotweed. But we really need to roll that out to at least 29 other species to be getting the same effect. And then lastly, yep, there are webinars, and today is an example of that. And as Andy said, if you've got any suggestions, let us know what would be useful to you. They're a valuable means of reaching a lot of people efficiently with a low carbon impact. So just as a for instance, and it links very much into the webinar today, is a course looking at what is the existing, a course looking at invasive weeds business development and diversification. It's aimed at PCA members, looking at developing our businesses, responding to challenges beyond Japanese knotweed, building on the foundation of Japanese knotweed, but how can we explore new habitats and so on. So have a look on the website, see if that fits in with where you are and where you're going. It could be quite a valuable step forward for you. So picking up on Japanese knotweed, excuse me, it's sort of a good basis for developing our knowledge and competence in combating invasive weeds. It's a good 10 plus years that the development has taken, and I think that's probably quite important in terms of managing expectations. I'm talking glibly about joined up approaches and risk assessments and so on and so forth. Yeah, we've achieved quite a lot of that with Japanese knotweed, but it took a number of years. So let's sort of bear that in mind. This isn't going to be improved overnight. It will take time. One of the things that has happened as a result of the sort of focus on Japanese knotweed is a focus on the urban environment, particularly the residential sector. And during that time, probably to a certain extent, not surprisingly, volunteer groups have emerged, particularly in the form of local action groups, dealing with invasive species in the wider environment. So again, part of the joined up approach is needing to see where the link is between the knowledge, experience and confidence built up over the last 10 years within the invasive weed control group of the PCA, and how that fits and can be linked into the work that is being undertaken by local action groups. And somewhat new over the last few years is the opportunity for us to engage with the responses to the biodiversity crisis that I mentioned right at the outset of the presentation. This includes such things as nature recovery networks. Nature recovery networks have been or are in the process of being produced across the land. It's the responsibility of local authorities and working with a range of stakeholders are looking to help nature recover through these strategies. There are also green and blue infrastructure plans being produced, having been produced by local authorities, and more recently, so kicked off in February last month, the implementation of biodiversity net gain. There's not the time to go into these in any detail. It's something I actually pick up on in the course that I mentioned a minute or two ago. But the two key aspects I think we need to take away this morning from looking at these strategies, these initiatives that are being taken. The firstly, invasive non-native plants and animals are inimical to the biodiversity recovery. In your nature recovery network, you do not want invasive plants. Biodiversity net gain is reduced where you have invasive species as part of your assessment and how you're going to achieve biodiversity net gain. So that's the sort of first point. They need to be dealt with. They need to be removed as part of whatever the scheme is, again, in a structured, coordinated way to ensure you're getting maximum biodiversity benefit. The second point, and it helps, I think, in terms of talking to those engaged in delivering these strategies, is that unfortunately, by achieving a sort of a wildlife corridor, a blue infrastructure, these initiatives clearly need to achieve an ability for plants and animals to move, respond to climate change, etc. But they also provide potentially fantastic ways for invasive plants and animals to move along them as well. So, that we really do have a role to play, a significant role to play in dealing with invasive species within these schemes. Going back to the answer being 30, again, biodiversity net gain, and this is a sort of an exciting aspect from our point of view, and from the point of view of sort of ecologists and environmental managers. Biodiversity net gain is a process that will run for 30 years. A site, a project where biodiversity credits need to be produced in order to achieve that sort of the net gain. There is a period of 3 decades with associated management and monitoring to ensure that the gain is not only achieved but it's maintained. So really important for us to see this as these schemes as opportunities for us to engage in them. We've got a role to play, but also it helps us to be sustainable in terms of the input that we can make and the running of our businesses. So I think this indicates that we do need to be taking a proactive approach, and it needs to be comprehensive. We need to be looking at the way in which we sort of present the approaches we're taking, that they need to be green and sustainable. Indications around the country are we need to be careful and not to assume that herbicide treatments, etc., are immediately acceptable. Having people wandering around the environment suited up in protective clothing, spraying stuff, is not necessarily going to be easily accepted. And surveys, for example, as I said earlier, for plants like Japanese knotweed, where clients see a sort of priority, but we should also be drawing their attention to sort of other invasive plants in the immediate site or in the environment of the site. And going back to the GB invasive non-native species strategy, and we knew all this already, but we need to build it in more in a more structured way. Preventative measures, risk assessment, rapid response, horizon scanning are all key aspects of where we need to be moving to in terms of the approaches that we're taking. These are all, from a business point of view, these are all services that we can offer, advice that we can bring to a more concerted approach in terms of dealing with these plants. So, what have you learned from the webinar? I hope that you've sort of got a recognition of the breadth of impacts of invasive non-native plants, and particularly the negative effects on biodiversity, which now have a significantly higher profile sort of over the last, certainly over the last decade, and at the moment sort of peaking to a certain extent with schemes like biodiversity net gain. I hope that I've shown you, as I've worked through the content, how professional invasive weed management needs to develop, the opportunities that are there. Some have been there for a little while. Some are emerging for us to sort of think about and respond to. It'll take time, but we need to be developing our responses, which, if we're going to be successful, have to feed into a more connected and collaborative approach. Connected as in better decision making, better informed risk assessments, better data in order to inform those decisions, but also sort of collaborating across the sort of various stakeholders, from local action groups to statutory agencies to sort of professional invasive weed managers. If I was going to underline one of those bullet points, it would be this one. So a more connected and collaborative approach is absolutely essential. So we do need to work more closely with these organisations, leading to networking opportunities, seeing it very much as a progressive approach that with these new relationships, and we will need some new relationships in order to make this work, being so exciting and rewarding as we struggle, and we will struggle to meet the challenges that are posed by these plants. Additionally, bringing this sort of professional approach to invasive weed management, it's got to be from surveillance to monitoring. Let's not forget that, and particularly the monitoring. And we've got time to do some serious monitoring with some of these nature recovery projects that are ongoing. I hope I've directed you to or reminded you about some of the guidance that's available, both not just for you, but also for your customers, your clients, for your projects. You've got the opportunity to undertake fairly straightforward online learning that's provided, and there's a project ongoing at the moment that DEFRA is coordinating, looking at the resources for training in relation to invasive non-native species. So the outcome of that will be quite useful, and you can benefit by gaining a couple of PCA CPD points. So big thanks for listening, and time to hand over to Andy to see how we're doing on the questions.
Oh, well, no, here, thanks, Max, and many thanks for sharing all that insight and information. Just where we've got everyone, we don't have a lot of questions, so if you do have a question that you want to pose to Max, I would encourage you to do it now. All you need to do is just basically go to the chat facility, which on the desktop is just run down the right or the left hand side, and just pose your question in there. Or if you want, you can just ping me a quick email just at andy@property-care.org. Max, I have to say, I absolutely loved your 42 versus 30 description. Very, very quirky. I also have to say that, do you know, every time I hear the name Tree of Heaven, I always think it's just really, really ironic. I mean, it almost kind of masks the devil and its potential for impact and damage in environments. And I know that we in the UK are not necessarily as impacted on Tree of Heaven as Europe is, but I'm getting the feeling from yourself that's just potentially a matter of time before that comes across.
Yes, it's an interesting one, and I certainly caught the cities like Berlin by surprise, I think, in terms of just how successful it is. It's got a two-pronged approach. It can produce quite large numbers of seeds. It's a bit like ash in the ash trees in terms of the way it produces seeds. So they're sort of relatively large, but it can produce a lot of them. But it also produces suckers and can extend quite a long way from the tree. And it's also got a sort of it's got a built-in revenge factor. So the plant's sitting there with all the suckers coming from it. Along comes a developer, chops down said offensive tree, which triggers all the suckers to suddenly start sprouting. And that can be across an area of, a couple hundred square meters. It's quite dramatic. It's quite dramatic and revengeful on behalf of the plant. But yeah, no, it's got a recipe that is successful and one we need to watch.
And I do agree, and I suspect many of the individuals that were joining us this morning agree too on that comment on the joined up approach. Now, I'm taking from your slides, it seems to be a bit of a journey to go here to kind of almost join the dots on here. But I suppose the first step is kind of recognising the journey that we actually need to do and recognising the dots that we actually have to join. I suppose, which is comforting, is, as you mentioned in your webinar there, we actually seem to have a really good surveillance network, which I suppose seems to be a good start. It's now just building on that. Would you say that's fair to say?
Oh no, it absolutely is, Andy, and I think it's sort of a demonstration of just what we're looking at for the. I mean, this is for plants, both native and non-native, but the latest atlas for which gives you the distribution nationally for these plants comes in 2 volumes, and you need to undertake sort of a lifting health and safety course before you actually take it off the shelf. And it just demonstrates the huge amount of data that are available. Perhaps not so great in terms of the invasive non-native species, but a database that we can certainly add to. But I think I like your idea of sort of joining up the dots. It will be good to sort of try and create an environment where so we could sort of sit down, going back to this sort of new relationships idea, sit down and identify the dots. I think we all know what the dots are, but then how do we join them up? Who needs to do the joining? Who needs to do the leading? So that we have a better sort of joined up approach. And it was interesting going back and having a look at that Southeast England RIMPS, where the strategy there, it was pretty comprehensive, but actually a couple of key stakeholders were missing in terms of the professional consultant ecologist. These are guys and girls who are out there on day-to-day basis, assessing sites again across the land, and they're picking up information on and giving advice in terms of dealing with invasive species that are going to get in the way of development. That's nothing new. That's been going on for a long time, but it's not then joined up in terms of what's going on within the Southeast region. How does that fit in with schemes, etc.? How can it add to the sort of overall success? So yeah, be good to sit down. Agree on the dots and see how to join them up.
Absolutely. Well, we went from having only a couple of questions to all of a sudden a waterfall of questions, which is great. And thanks, guys, for pinging in. Just before I start on the questions, just for those that have been pinging me an email and private comments, yes, this webinar is recorded, and yes, anyone that's on the registration list will automatically receive the recording of this webinar next week. So, Max, I'm going to start off with questions that came in via email first. The first question came in from Philip McCarver. He's asking, in terms of invasive weed management, how does the UK in general compare to other countries? Are we better or are we worse?
I would say we're part of leading the way. In Europe, we were certainly leading the way till we made a bad decision, and now we're on our own. I sort of had a stark reminder of that the other day when I was reading a paper about identifying potential invasive species across Europe, and for each of the species there was a map of Europe showing sort of various arrows and distributions and so on. For the UK, it was blank, and it was an EU funded project. So I think that was a sort of a stark reminder that, okay, we were very much part of, for example, the development of the invasive alien species regulation within the EU, etc. But now we're on our own. Other countries that are definitely well ahead of us would be New Zealand, Australia, South Africa. They put a lot of effort into it in North America, and not surprisingly, it's on a state by state basis, and there's some really good examples there. I would have thought we're quite similar in some ways to some of the approaches that have been taken in the States. But yeah, we can hold our head up in terms of taking our responsibility of dealing with these plants seriously, as from a national point of view. So yeah, I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, well, interestingly, what you just mentioned in New Zealand, and I'm kind of skipping over questions here, but Holly Francis, good morning, Holly, and hopefully it's a sensible time down in New Zealand with you kind of watching this. But Holly has made a comment regarding them. They have some crassula, which is New Zealand pygmyweed, growing on filter beds at water recycling centres. I suppose what she's asking is, what advice would you potentially give here to help treat and dispose of this? Now, do you have any experience with this particular plant?
Unfortunately, yes. More than I would wish to have. So my first serious encounter of it was Holly was in our Lake District up in Cumbria, doing a survey of one of our larger lakes, Derwent Water, and within a snorkel survey, and within about 5 minutes, encountered this New Zealand pygmyweed, sometimes called Australian swamp stonecrop, and I swam over acres and acres of it. It completely displaced the native vegetation in this huge, wonderful lake. So, and as I say, unfortunately, I've encountered it sort of on quite a number of other occasions. Answering the question, do keep an eye on the work that CABI is doing. That's CABI. They're developing a mite that attacks the growing tips of the crassula. It's an amphibious and submerged and growing on the edges of water bodies, and the growing tips are being targeted as a biological control approach. So keep an eye on that. If on your filter beds, if it's out of the water, then you could think of using a herbicide. That might work, as long as it doesn't get submerged, because it just washes off the herbicide, or the herbicide. A herbicide like glyphosate would just be inactivated. I think the last comment would be, unfortunately, dealing with New Zealand pygmyweed crassula, it's a sort of a nuclear option in a way. You just have to destroy the habitat completely and then put it back together again, having got rid of the crassula, which is doable for sort of ponds, small water bodies, etc. But it obviously is not feasible for large water bodies like Derwent Water and reservoirs and so on.
Well, Joe, just because we're talking about specifics, I'm going to jump onto a comment that Dave Bates made, which was, what about gorse bush? I've never actually heard of that particular plant. I mean, is that within the UK, Max?
Well, gorse, yeah. I mean, gorse. If I'm right, and you're thinking about the gorse, the sort of scientific name's Ulex europaeus, but that's a native species. But it's a really good example of, and I did somewhat skip over the fact that we need to pay attention to native species. Gorse can invade into sensitive habitats and can be quite a problem as an invasive scrub. There's quite good advice in terms of and management that's available for plants like gorse and other shrubs that can invade into grasslands and so on. But yeah, it's native, but it can be a real problem. And pardon the pun, it's very prickly.
Well, here I'm going to move on. I'm conscious of time here. I'm going to kind of combine two questions that have come in, one via email and one from India that's just come in from the comments. Kate Stubbs emailed in. Now, to kind of give you a bit of context, I think Kate is either a chartered surveyor or a building surveyor, so that's the kind of background that she's got. But she's asking, how onerous is it, in your view, for surveyors to try and gain a working knowledge of all these potential invasive weeds? And I suppose India has led on from that, asking, is there a specific list of invasive species found in the UK that they can kind of reference or use? Okay,
so in terms of property surveying, which I suspect is what we're talking about, I think it's fairly well recognised what the species are that you do need to look out for. So I think, and here we are looking at the distinction between the sort of the urban environment and the wider biodiversity impact of these species. So there are relatively few plants that are going to pose problems to built structures and influence house prices and so on and so forth. So you've got your Japanese knotweeds. There are a few bamboo species that can cause really quite significant problems. But also don't forget the native species in the form of trees. Any trees, tree of heaven is an example, but so would ash and beech and oak. Unfortunately, in the wrong place, they can pose problems to built structures. So I think from that point of view, so a common sense approach is the one to take. And I know Daniel Docking at the PCA has been providing advice, and maybe something we could even think of doing a guidance note on is, what are the other plants that surveyors should be paying attention to? It's not necessarily just built structures. You don't really want you don't really want giant hogweed growing at the bottom of the garden, particularly if you've got kiddies and so on. So it's more complicated than I've suggested. List of plants. Non-native species secretariat website is pretty good in terms of providing some of that. I think it's something again that maybe talking with Daniel, it's something we could sort of post maybe through PCA. Here's the list of species that the Reading University research has identified. Keep an eye out for them. Coventry University or etc. So unfortunately it's a moving feast, and not surprisingly, new plants etc. will emerge, but it can be done. I think that could be something, just thinking about it, that we could use invasive non-native species week as a way of drawing attention. Just look at how many plants are out there that we need to be looking at. So, and thanks for the comment on invasive species week. Keep an eye out for it, everybody.
Yes, no, absolutely. This is something that certainly at the PCA we will be supporting, and we hope many others joining this webinar will be supporting it as well. Max, you made a comment about bamboo there, which ties nicely into a question that Catherine Burtonshaw asked, which is in regards to the TA6 form. She's asking, were you disappointed that the new TA6 form issued by the Law Society this week contains no mention of bamboo, despite previous indications that they were considering it and adding it in as a relevant section?
Yeah, this is a bit of a Pandora's box, so I'll probably just give them time, give a sort of a shorties answer. In a way, I just don't think we're ready to do something like that. I think it would be very unfortunate to blanket what would be all bamboos, because at the moment we don't differentiate between the different species. There are at least 12 to 20 species that you could have in your garden, and only a few of those will be invasive and be problematic. So it will be very unfortunate for the horticultural trade to sort of almost put a ban on having bamboos in your garden. So it's more complicated. It actually feeds quite nicely back into risk assessment. Yeah, bamboos can be a problem, but at the moment we don't have a good way of risk assessing them. So yeah, I understand the frustration, but we need to do a bit more work and understand before we, if we wanted to go to that stage of recommending something like that. So I hope that's helpful.
No worries.
Just to let you know, Invasive Species Week is the week of the 20th of May.
Yes.
So get it in your diary.
Yeah, and I've already put a link out in the chat if people want to
thanks, Andy.
Kept updated for Invasive Species Week. And I'll also make sure that that link is in the show notes for the replay email going out, along with other resources that Max has kind of mentioned over the course of the replay, over the course of the webinar, sorry. Max, I'm just going to hit you with one more question because I'm conscious of time. I'm going to lift the question from Angela because I know Angela is tuned in all the way from Australia. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever it is over there, Angela. Angela is asking, at the moment, horsetail spore heads are just popping through. Is there anything worth doing just now that that will be detrimental to the vigour of this infestation, i.e., is it worthwhile actually cutting it or starting to spray it?
I think, first of all, Angela, hi. Great to have you on the webinar. Hope you're well. Horsetail. So yeah, I think if they're popping away, there's going to be literally millions of spores flying around. So it's probably a bit late to sort of stop the spread. But I think the spread of horsetail is much more of a problem in terms of its sort of underground rhizome root network, etc., which is what you've got to get at in order to achieve some sort of level of control. In a nutshell, what you're trying to do is damage the underground sort of root rhizome structure, and then get sort of a herbicide on it in order to sort of kill the sort of the vegetative matter, on the assumption that after a few treatments, because you won't get it first time, but if you keep working at it, you will sort of achieve control. Again, for those of us in the UK, do bear in mind there are a number of species of horsetail, most of which are actually very well behaved, and some are actually quite rare. So please don't go around spraying and killing all of them. But do a risk assessment. Check, before you launch in. There can be a problem. The sort of advice that I've just given would apply in the UK as well as in Australia. But do a risk assessment first. It's not always necessary.
Ideal. No, many thanks for sharing your insights and the questions, Max. Just before we kind of finish off, just in case you are looking for additional information, you heard Max mention some resources over the webinar, and you guys on the webinar as well, you have dropped links onto resources as well online. I will take those links and add them into the show notes. I've just shoved in some links to some professional help and guidance towards invasive weeds, whether it be on our CPD webinar library, our technical document library, or our professional guidance pages. They are there for you guys to use. And again, on the replay, I'll make sure these are on the show notes. If you are interested in expanding your knowledge even further, there is training courses that you guys can actually jump onto as well. You heard Max talking about it just earlier on there. There is Max's brand new one about invasive weeds, business development and diversification. I do have to say this is a PCE members only course, but you did also hear about Max mentioning about the invasive plant identification training. I'll say no more on that because I think Max already kind of described it out enough on it. For those that tuned in right at the very start, you would have heard me mention about a webinar survey. We are keen to hear your thoughts and suggestions on how we can deliver and improve on these webinars. Now, to help us out, I'm hoping everyone will be able to just take 2 minutes of time and complete a very short survey for us. It will help us understand what exactly you guys actually want and what you would like to hear from us about. Now, I've shoved the link into the chat just at the moment. I will include it within the replay email and the show notes. But yes, if everyone could just take that 2 minutes and just let us know, that would be fabulous. Just before we go, for anyone as well that is really interested in learning more about the challenges, developments, and emerging issues facing many professionals over many sectors, I just want to say I would encourage you to check out our newly launched 2024 International Invasive Weed Conference. It takes place on the 28th of November. If you've been there before, you know this is a great day filled with valuable learning. We're currently working on the programme at the moment and speakers, but I can tell you it is shaping up to potentially be another one of our best conferences yet. If you are interested, I've just stuck the link into the chat again, and again, I will make sure it's in the show notes. Just before finishing off, just to let you know, our next webinar will take place on the 26th of April. We haven't quite got it up yet, but it will be along the lines of the fundamentals of timber decay, still kind of playing about with the title, but we do hope to see many of you coming along there. So just look out for any information coming via email or social media. Lastly, I just want to say, firstly, Max, to yourself, a big, big thank you for coming on board and taking the time to kind of share your guidance, information, and insights. Much, much appreciated, not only on behalf of everyone at the PCA, but also as well for all our listeners that joined us. I just want to say a big thank you to everyone that joined us this morning as well. We hope you got some real valued learning. And lastly, I just want to say good morning to everyone, and hopefully you have a lovely rest of the day. Bye, everyone.